Hi everybody. In this video, we're going to just very briefly look at the classification system and why we use things like scientific names and how we come up with scientific names. So when we look at the classification system, we are basically grouping objects according to natural relationships. We realize there are millions of different types of species. And, some things look like plants that aren't plants, like algae. Algae is not a plant. Seaweed is not a plant. Things might look like, an animal that aren't animals, or they might act like. And so we had to figure out a way of dividing things up and classifying it. It would be a very simple or very easy thing. Like I could give everybody a Ziploc baggie full of pasta, and you all have the same kind of pasta in there, the same different colors, the same different shapes, and I asked you to divide them into groups. But you would divide them differently. Some of you might divide your pasta based on color, like you'll put all the yellow pasta together, the green pasta together, the orange pasta together. Some of you might divide the pasta based on their shapes. And so this became a problem that scientists noticed as to how creatures get divided up. So they had to come up with a very detailed classification system in order for this to happen. And this is also where scientific names come into play. So what we're looking at is this concept that we call taxonomy. And taxonomy is the science of grouping organisms according to their evolutionary characteristics. And what we mean by that is great example, we can't really use color. We can't use color, we try not to use color to divide things up. Because if you look at human beings, for example, we have all different shades of skin. We have dark skin, we have light skin, we have ivory skin, we have brown skin, we have very, very pale skin, but we're still all humans. But if we divided creatures up based on their color, think about all the different colored dogs out there. The different color, goldfish have different color. They're not all gold. So we had to come up with very specific rules as to how we're going to divide things up. So we tended to look at evolutionary characteristics. What's their body structure? What are they similar to? And back in the ancient Greek time, you were either a plant or an animal. That's all they knew. Okay? And, animals, so fungi and seaweed, things like that were considered to be plants. But now we have microscopes and we can study chemistry and we know that there are differences. And so we've had to put them into different groups. But modern day classification is based on the system of this gentleman named Carolus Linnaeus. His name is actually Carl Linnaeus, but he changed his name to make it look like a scientific name, just like Homo sapiens that we have today. And what this kind of helped us do is get rid of this misconception, because scientists often found they had different common names for the same organism. So for example, you might go to Yellowstone National Park for a trip and you take pictures of the buffalo you see there, while your neighbor goes to China and takes pictures of the buffalo they see there. And when you bring them home, you realize that these are two very different creatures. They're both called buffalo. But just a side note, the American buffalo has gone extinct. What most people here in America call a buffalo is actually a bison. But, common misconception, a lot of people call it buffalo. So if you take these two pictures, you realize, okay, I'm not talking about the same creature. So what we call a buffalo, or what several people call a buffalo here in America, is very different from what people call buffalo in Asia. So that's a common misconception. That's the problem. Where there's two different creatures being called the same thing. Same thing is true if you were to say cat. When we talk about our cat, we are thinking of just the nice little feline that we have running around our house. But if you go to parts of Africa, when you say the word cat, you're talking about a tiger, or you're talking about a lion. So again, two very different pictures come into the person's head. Or you might go to a mountain resort and you take a picture of this big cat you see in the tree. And you come home and you tell all your friends about the mountain lion you saw. And then your friend goes and says, well, I saw a panther. And somebody else says, well, I saw a lynx. And when you take a picture, it's all the same cat. So we had to come up with a way of making sure that when somebody hears a name, the picture that forms in their head is the exact right picture. So by having classification, this allows us to give them very specific scientific names. So when we do scientific naming, okay, what you consider a common name is what we tend to use in everyday conversation. Like, for example, we say cat, we say dog, we say mountain lion, panther, buffalo, bison. But again, what you call a cat in the United States might be very different than what somebody in another country calls a cat, or what you call a dog, again, might be very different to somebody who, when you're talking about a dog, you might be talking about a coyote. So we had to come up with the scientific names, and these are universal because in the case of scientific names, we use what's called binomial nomenclature. Now, the root word bi means two, and nome means name. So binomial nomenclature actually means two name naming. All scientific names have two parts to them. The first part is what we call the genus, and the second part is the specific epithet, which we'll talk more about later. But most of you know we are Homo sapiens. That's our scientific name. And we got two parts to it. Homo, which means man, sapiens, which means thinking. We are the thinking man. And when you see scientific names, don't get freaked out because we're going to be practicing root words throughout the course, and you'll be able to recognize a lot of scientific names give you a clue about what that creature is. So when we do scientific names, the scientific name has to be in Latin. And the reason for that is Latin is a dead language, meaning nobody speaks Latin anymore, other than the Vatican and parts of Italy. But what that means is we don't have to worry about slang. You know, the English language changes. Every language changes. When I was growing up, bad meant something you didn't want to be. But then Michael Jackson came out with a song, Bad, and it meant to be cool. So that word changed. And the past 25 years, the word muggle has shown up. For my Harry Potter fans, you know what muggles are, non-magical humans. Well, it was a made-up word, but now muggle is in the dictionary. So languages that are spoken can change over time. But since Latin is no longer spoken, we don't have to worry about changes in slang. So this is why when we talk about scientific words or scientific terminology, they're always going to be in Latin. And so just like you have a first name and a last name, scientific names have two parts. And just like you capitalize your name, the first word of a scientific name is also capitalized. And that's to show respect for that creature. This is a living creature. We're being respectful of it. Now, the second word, however, unlike our last names, is not capitalized. But again, to show respect to that creature, the word is either underlined or it's in italics. Anytime somebody handwrites a scientific name, you underline it. Because if you're reading something and you see something that's underlined, it draws your eye to it. And that's to show respect for that creature. If it's typed, it's going to be in italics. Most of us can't write in italics. So when we write a scientific name, we're going to underline it. If you type it, you can underline it, but it tends to go into italics. So when we look at taxonomy, we actually have to take things and put them into different groups. And we have 7 levels of taxonomy. Some people are saying that we have 8. We're just going to focus on these 7 right now. It's what we call kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. King Philip came over for great soup. And in the case of science, when I was in high school, we only had 5 kingdoms. However, with technology, we realized we needed to take one kingdom and divide it into 2 different groups. In this course, we're going to be talking about 6 kingdoms. But by the time your children are taking biology, it's very likely we're going to have 8 kingdoms. And we'll talk more about that as the course goes on. But we have right now 6 kingdoms. Kingdoms are at the very, very, very top. These are the most general groups you can have. So kingdoms would be like plants. So all the plants in nature, or animals, all the animals in nature. Kingdoms are very, very, very general, very, very, very broad. For example, to be an animal, you just have to be multicellular. You have to be a heterotroph, which means you feed off of something. You don't have a cell wall. You have to be eukaryotic, which means your cell has a nucleus, and you have to move at some point in time in your life. That's all it takes to be an animal. Sponges are animals. They barely classified as animals, but sponges are animals. And you're like, but sponges don't move. They do as larvae. They're like little worms. So kingdoms are very, very, very general. And then we take all these creatures in this kingdom and we're like, okay, how can we divide them up? And that gives us the next group, which is a phylum. Now, there are so many creatures in nature, you will see the term division. Phylum and division are at the same level. But just know to yourself, anytime you see phylum, this is something that does not have a cell wall. It would have been classified as an animal back when there were only 2 kingdoms. Anytime you see something that's a division, that means it has a cell wall, so it would have been classified as a plant back in the day. So for example, if you see phylum, this is either something that's an animal or something called a protozoan. If you see division, it's either going to be a bacteria, a plant, an algae, or a fungus. And then we can get more and more and more specific as we go down, okay, until we reach the most specific thing, which is something called a species. Now, if you like definitions, you would work your way backwards. So for example, a genus is a group of species that are similar. A family is a group of genera, which are similar. An order is a group of families that's similar. A class is a group of orders that are similar. A phylum is a group of classes that are similar. And then a kingdom is a group of phylum or divisions that are similar. And so each of these levels we've been looking at is called a taxon. That's where taxonomy gets its name from. And they get more specific as you go down. Okay. So for example, when you look at these names, they try to tell you something about this creature. So we're looking at this picture. We know it's an animal. And so then we're like, okay, how can we take all the animals in nature and divide it up? Oh, well, this animal has a spinal cord. It has a nerve cord. So therefore, we have what's called phylum Chordata. The cord lets you know it has a nerve cord. Well, lots of animals have nerve cords. So how can I take this group of animals and break it up into smaller groups? Oh, this creature makes milk. So we put it in class Mammalia. Well, there's lots of mammals in nature. So how can I take all those mammals and divide it up? Well, this mammal happens to be a meat eater. It's a carnivore. So notice we put in an order Carnivora. Well, there's lots of carnivores out there. So how can I look at these creatures and break them up? Oh, they have retractable claws. They're a cat. So we put them in family Felidae. And then we're like, okay, well, how can I take all the cats in nature and start divide it up? And so eventually we'll get the genus Panthera and then the species, the Pardus. And so the scientific name here is Panthera pardus. So the more general grouping is at the top, and you work your way down until you get to one very specific creature. And that's what gives them the scientific name. So the scientific name is a combination of their genus name as well as their species name. And like I mentioned, when we talk about kingdoms, kingdoms are a group of phylum or divisions that are similar. And there are now 6 recognized kingdoms. We have kingdom Archaeobacteria, kingdom Eubacteria, kingdom Protista, kingdom Fungi, kingdom Planta, and kingdom Animalia. Back when I was in high school, we did not have kingdom Archaeobacteria or kingdom Eubacteria. We had what was called kingdom Monera. If you're a bacteria, you're automatically put in kingdom Monera. But with technology we have today, we realize that the structure of some bacteria are very different. So we had to split this into 2 different groups. By the time your kids get into high school, kingdom Protista will probably no longer exist. Kingdom Protista is probably going to be split into 3 different groups. So we will have kingdom Protozoan, kingdom Alga, and then the 3rd kingdom, they haven't quite figured out what they're going to call it yet. Now in biology, we're going to look at all these different kingdoms. But the first kingdom here is what's called kingdom Archaeobacteria. Now, in nature, we have 2 types of cells. You have what we call prokaryotes, which are cells that do not have a nucleus protecting the DNA. And you have eukaryotes, which means you do have a nucleus to protect your DNA. Well, all bacteria are prokaryotes. They do not have a nucleus to protect their DNA. And one group of bacteria is called Archaeobacteria. The root word archae means ancient. We actually believe that these are descendants of the very first creatures to evolve in nature. Okay? These are actually believed to be the first type of cells. Now, in biology, we do look at it from an evolutionary standpoint. I'm not asking you to believe how evolution occurred. I'm just asking you to understand this idea, this theory. And I'm not even going to tell you what I believe as far as evolution is concerned, but I am going to present the information to you. So it is believed that at some point in time, life occurred on Earth. And it's believed that the very first type of bacteria to form was called Archaeobacteria. Archaeobacteria live in very extreme environments. These are not the type of bacteria that you think of when you think of bacteria. Archaeobacteria are found in really, really, really hot water or really, really, really salt water. The picture you're seeing here is a hot spring. Okay? It was actually taken flying over the hot spring. So this is actually a very, very, very large body of water. And you can see the steam coming off of it, and you can see the walkway that goes over this area because the crust is very thin. Well, all this orange is not lava. It's trillions and trillions and trillions of this Archaeobacteria that live in this hot water, and they feed off of things that bubble up from deep down in the earth. Archaeobacteria can be what are called halophytes. Halophytes live in really, really, really salty water, like the Dead Sea or the Great Salt Lakes. Thermophytes obviously are going to be things that live in really, really hot water. They are prokaryotic, which means they do not have a nucleus to protect their DNA, and they're all unicellular. They're just one cell. They do have cell walls around them, which is why when we first got microscopes, people believed that these were plants. And they can be heterotrophic, which means they feed, or they can be autotrophic, which means they make their own food. Eubacteria is what you think of when you think of normal everyday bacteria. So things like strep throat, E. coli bacteria, anthrax, what we call modern bacteria. Now we had to divide these into two different groups because of something that they have in their cell walls. They're also unicellular, and they're also prokaryotes. Again, if you're not familiar with the term prokaryote, that means it does not have a nucleus. And the reason we had to take what was called kingdom Monera and turn it into kingdom Archaeobacteria and kingdom Eubacteria is the cell wall composition. If you live in salt water, you're going to have different things in your cell wall than if you live in hot water. And what we found when we looked at these types of bacteria is that they all have a chemical in them called peptidoglycan. Now, anytime you see peptide, that means it's a protein. Anytime you see glyc, that means it's sugar. So peptidoglycan is a sugar protein substance that shows up in this type of bacteria cell wall. And it's the only place in nature we find that. This is why we had to take bacteria and put them into two different kingdoms. And again, they can be autotrophic, like these here that do photosynthesis, or they're heterotrophic, which means they have to feed off of something. Kingdom Protista is what we call the hodgepodge kingdom. It's also called the junkyard kingdom. If you don't fit anywhere else, we got to put you somewhere, we put you in this kingdom. And this is the kingdom that probably will not exist in several years because they're going to take this kingdom and divide it up. And it's going to be divided up into three different groups. Some creatures like algae are what we call plant-like. They look like a plant, they act like a plant, but they don't have the same parts of the plant. Things called protozoans act like animals, but they're not multicellular like animals. And then we have the fungus-like group, which is the one that's kind of throwing us for a loop. But eventually Kingdom Protista is probably going to be divided up into three different groups based on these characteristics. Okay. They're eukaryotic, which means they have a nucleus, and that nucleus is there to protect their DNA. Okay. Some are unicellular, some are multicellular. What you think of as seaweed, multicellular. And again, some are autotrophic, which means they feed, they make their own food, and some are heterotrophic, which means they have to feed off of something. The groups you're familiar with is fungi. These are ones called plants as well because they have a cell wall. So you're going to see that these are called divisions. Okay. Mushrooms, truffles, shelf fungi, these are all things that you're probably familiar with. They're eukaryotic, which means they have a nucleus to protect their DNA. Some are unicellular, like yeast, but 99.999% of them are multicellular, which is why when kingdom Protista gets split up, yeast will probably be taken out of the fungus group and put into whatever that fungus-like group is. Okay. And they have a special substance in their cell wall called chitin. And they're all heterotrophic, which means they have to feed. They're actually decomposers. Which then leads us to the two that we're all very familiar with. We have plants. Okay. Plants are all eukaryotes, which means they have a nucleus to protect their DNA. They're all multicellular, which is why some types of algae cannot be called plants. They all have a cell wall, and their cell wall is made from cellulose. Now keep in mind, anytime you see OSE at the end of the word, cellulose, glucose, lactose, that means it's a sugar. They're all autotrophic, which means they make their own food. And they're actually thought to have evolved from a group of algae called chlorophyta, which is green algae. And last but not least are the animals. Now animals are all eukaryotes, which means we have a nucleus around our DNA. We're all multicellular. We do not have a cell wall. We're all heterotrophs. And like I said before, we're going to be classified into phylums. Now, speaking of classification, you're going to learn how to do what's called a dichotomous key. There are millions and millions and millions of creatures in nature, and every single one of them that has been discovered has been given a scientific name. And we use dichotomous keys in order to figure out, is this a creature that's never been seen before? Now, back in the day, you would have hundreds of books that you might have to flip through following one key. Luckily now, most of it's computerized. But the next video and the activities you're going to be doing is going to help you figure out how to read a dichotomous key.